Welcome to Glad You're Asked. Today we'll be talking about everybody's favorite subject at church is money. And so we're going to answer the question that I received recently, how much money should I give to the church? So money is often, a very difficult subject to talk about at church because often the church is seen as just wanting to get your money. And so that's not our approach at Grace Point. But money is something that we all need to think about. As a matter of fact, I think it could be a good barometer, maybe our relationship with the Lord. And so we should keep that in mind. Jesus spoke about money and possessions quite often. And really, when you come to the New Testament context, you find that money is really not so much about the amounts as it is the attitude. So we want to keep that in mind as we talk about the amount and how much you should give. And concerning the amounts, in the Old Testament, we have the idea of tithe, and tithe essentially means 10%. And so the Israelites were encouraged to give 10% of what they've earned in a tithe. But it's a little more involved than just giving 10%. Tithe was an Old Testament requirement, and actually there were 3 different tithes that the Levitical law, Mosaic law had for the Israelites. And so I wanted to show you those real quickly, and then we'll make some words about how much we should give today. So in the Old Testament, starting in Numbers 18:21 through 24, we discover what is called the Levitical tithe, which is these words: to the Levites I give every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of the meeting. If you don't know much about the Levites were the priests who took care of the temple, the tabernacle before the temple, and they didn't have land, and so they were provided for by the nation itself, the other 11 tribes. So the people of Israel, verse 22, do not come near to the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting. They shall bear their iniquity, and it shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations among the people of Israel. They shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, for they shall have no inheritance among the people of Israel. So we discovered Levites got a tithe so they could provide for their families and for their future. And then also we'll see, as a flip over to Numbers chapter 14, there was another tithe called the Thanksgiving tithe, which is Numbers 14:22 through 26, says, you shall tithe all your yield of your seed that comes from your field year by year. So this was a yearly tithe. And before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there. And you shall eat the tithe of your grain and your wine and your oil and the firstborn of your herd or flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And if the way is too long for you so that you are not able to carry the tithe when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far, which the Lord God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money and bind up the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord chooses and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or strong drink, whatever your appetite craves, and you shall eat there before the Lord. Rejoice, you and your household, and you shall not neglect the Levite who is within your towns, for he has no portion or inheritance with you. So what we discover is there is also the giving of the Thanksgiving tithe that the Israelites are required to give. So that's 2 tithes. You have a Levitical tithe, Thanksgiving tithe, so that's 10%. And then there is actually a third tithe here, also at the end of Deuteronomy 14:28. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out a tithe of all your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. The Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns shall come and eat and be filled. The Lord your God may bless you in all the work that your hands do. And so you have this, what we call an alms or a tithe, giving to the poor tithe. So you have these 3 tithes, and this one is to be given every 3 years, or you would give 3.3% every year. And so there's some debate on whether scholars believe that the actual tithe of the Israelites would be around 23.3% every year, or if it was every year it was 20%, and then on the 3rd year there'd be 30%. So if you say, well, how much should the Israelites give? Well, it would be either 23.3% yearly or 20%, and then on the third year, 30%. So what we see is this was commanded by the Old Testament law. Now, the Old Testament law was not abolished by Jesus. He said he came to fulfill it. So we're not commanded in the New Testament to give a tithe. And so when we say, should we give 10%? Well, that's not commanded in the New Testament. And just because it's not commanded doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means it's not commanded. You don't see it in the New Testament. And so when we think about what tithe really is, it's really the minimum standard that God gives to the Israelites so that they gave to take care of the Levites and the people in the nation and just to honor Him as being God. So we know that that's a minimum standard. So sometimes in church, when we say somebody's supposed to give a tithe, it sounds like it's a maximum, but really it's the bottom part of that. Now, it's important for us to understand that if you just were to probably Google this and got Google Smart and you put in what does the average American Christian give to church, the last time I looked, it was about 3%. So what you have at churches, most people are giving 3% on average, which really tells you a lot about maybe the way that the church is handling its money in relationship to God. And I want you to think about this for a second. If you said, hey, the amount of money that each believer should give to the church is 10%, and right now everybody's giving on average 3%, if you were to just to look at that numbers-wise, imagine what we could do if everybody did give 10%. I mean, it would be 3 times the amount of what the church takes in, not just Grace Point, but I mean all churches, and all the good that could be done in the community, the spread of the gospel. There's so many things that could be done if the church gives faithfully, even if you start with just a regular standard of 10%. And let me say this because I think it's important when we talk about a tithe. There's tithes, which is 10%, and then there's offerings, which is over and above that. And the thing that I would encourage you to think about is tithe is not a rule in the New Testament, but it is a guide. It's a good place to start. So practicing that with your kids or practicing that in your life, I think is a good thing. I will even say this and go far as to say this. If you're really stuck on what amount do you give, I would say pray about it. The biggest issue for a lot of people is that they need to start giving, and they need to start giving something, not nothing, to honor God as the Lord of their life, understand that He has created them, and so it's a good stewardship to acknowledge the Creator. Also, if God has saved you, to acknowledge what He's done in salvation for you. And so at Grace Point, we don't really say, hey, we want you to tithe, although we encourage that as a guide, not a rule. I really would say it's more like this. If you would ask me, how much should I give? The real answer is 100%. And the reason I say 100% is I think the New Testament is really about all of life stewardship. And so it's not really focused on the amount that a person per se gives, but we can use a tithe as a guide, but we really need to think of our lives as 100% to God, which brings me to a New Testament passage that has really impacted my life, is Romans 12:1. When I think about what I give, I'm not so much concerned about amounts, but my attitude of giving, and my attitude in giving, which should affect amounts, is 100%. I'm going to give 100% who I am to the Lord. That doesn't mean all of the money that I made in my life that I give it at one time to the church, but it just means 100% of what I have is yours, Jesus, because of who you are in my life. As Paul writes in Romans 12:1, in view of what Christ has done, he says this: I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to looking at what Christ has done for us, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So for me to worship is for me to be willing to give 100%. And really, I don't think God is so concerned about the amount, but that we do acknowledge Him with our money. There's a great passage in Mark's Gospel that I think captures this idea in the widow's offering, where she gives her last 2 cents. Let me read it to you. This is Mark chapter 12, starting at verse 41 through the end of the chapter, verse 44. And Jesus sat down opposite the treasury, and he watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in large sums, and a poor widow came and put 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. And he called his disciples to him, and he said, "Truly I say to you, the poor widow has put in more than all of those contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put everything she had, 100%, and all she had to live on." And so she trusted God to provide for her. She had very little, but she gave a lot. There were other people who had a lot and gave very little. So when it comes to the question, how much I should give, I would just encourage you to pray about what to give. Remember, and to consider a tithe is 10%, and it's a guide, not a rule, but the important thing I think for us is to have the attitude of 100% of what I have is yours, God, and then ask the question to God and say, God, what would you have me give at this time? Because we want to come to the right attitude in our giving and not be so much concerned with about amounts as we are. I want to do the right thing. I want to honor God, worship God through my giving. I want to help build up the church. I want to spread the gospel, and I want to make a difference in my community. So that's the answer to the question, how much should I give to the church? And I hope that helps you as you're working all these things out as you follow Jesus. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you asked. I hope this was encouraging to you. If you have a question, you can email that at info@gracepointchurch.org. And we look forward to seeing you again in worship this coming Sunday.